and welcome to Stch'd. My name is Sameer Mutreja. I'm a co-founder with Stch Experiential and Marketing Services. We all know what kind of problems the world is going through, economically and from a healthcare point of view. I think it's the next generation of leaders who will help us to find a path out of this. We try and bring you people who matter. Today's conversation is going to be very special because the guest I am about to call upon to share this forum is none other than Rahul Welde, the Executive Vice President Digital Transformation at Unilever. Rahul has been with Unilever since 1991 and has been in many roles across India, Singapore and now global role of UK. He's a very familiar face in the Indian industry, and despite having been away for a few years, he is well known in the advertising circle and the media circle. As we know, the world is catapulting into digital transformation faster than ever. His expertise will benefit us all. Today, we'll have a hearty conversation from the love of football to the thrill of racing to the new face of the virtual future. Rahul Welde has the answers. Hi, Rahul. Good to have you here on Stch'd with us.
Thanks, Sameer. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Rahul, I'll straight away jump into the questions which I've been so eager to ask. You have been a pioneer in digital transformation. For any business starting on the path of digital transformation, is there a broad template or a process which can be followed?
Yeah, Sameer, that's a great question because as we know, the last few years, we've seen acceleration of digital and technology across pretty much all sectors of business, society, etc. And so to your question on, is there a template? I don't think there is a set template as such. But I like to think of it along three vectors. Number one, of course, technology and the importance of digital technology. Number two is the process and how we re-engineer processes to actually meet this new technology. And the last and very important part of the triangle is people. So if you were to visualize technology, process, and people and uplift all three, which is greater technology in business, rewiring of processes so that they actually can leverage the new technologies, and fundamentally, addressing the people aspect, whether it comes to culture, whether it comes to skills and the kind of talent that actually runs the businesses. If this triangle works in tandem, then that's, I think, the ideal process for digital transformation, or for that matter, any transformation, but more specifically where technology plays a role.
There have been a lot of general conversations around digital transformation. The issue, however, is the MSME segment, the SME segment, the businesses which have never actually even thought through the first step of doing business digitally have now been accelerated into that thought process. What can I do? Where do I start as a business owner?
See, technology and digital is impacting lives across the entire spectrum. So this is not something just for big corporations to address, but indeed the medium scale companies, even the small scale companies, and I would argue even going downstream, because it touches so many aspects of lives. I mean, just as a practical example, think of a taxi service or think of even people who are now doing digital payments, and even some of the autos are taking digital payments. You stretch that to restaurants, you stretch that to small businesses, medium scale, and indeed companies. But I think the central question is, which all businesses need to ask, is how do I serve my consumers better? How do I service my customers better? And the moment you begin to answer that question and take it from that end, then you figure out that there are so many ways in which technology can actually benefit that entire value chain. And much like that, actually, even if you think of the back end, which is the manufacturing operations or service operations or whatever it might be, again, right. If we answer this question, how do we make our operations more efficient? How do we enhance the quality? How do we enhance the speed? The moment we begin to answer those questions, in many ways, we find solutions which are in technology and processes.
I have started thinking digital transformation. What are going to be my obvious roadblocks?
I think the first, I wouldn't say it's a roadblock, but it all starts with opening the mindset, right? And there are various different ways in which it can be articulated, but fundamentally having a mindset which is open to this transformation. That's, I think, point number one. Point number two is accepting that this is not just about a mindset change, but actually putting that into execution and execution at speed, right? So I think that's a very important dimension. So everybody talks about it, like you said, everybody discusses it, But how do we bring that into practice is a matter of actually getting into the game and then beginning to play it. And then, as you go along, you discover, what works and what doesn't. But sitting on the edges is no longer an option. So I think whether big or small companies, to your earlier point, and you mentioned the point about MSMEs, and often I've had many conversations with different people. I've got friends who run companies which are small, big, etc. And I think the single line is really that this is now for everyone.
Right. So sitting on the edge is not an option. I completely agree with you on that. I think that brings us to a very important part, which we, touched upon it in the last question as well. That culture plays a key role in the transformation. Now, what do you feel are the most important aspects of culture in transformation?
Culture has always played an important role in business, right? It has played an important role regardless of what the business is about. I think there's a change, however, in recent times, and that recent times change to a large extent, I would say, has been driven by technology. What are the changes? I think the first change which one has to bring about in culture is about collaboration. And the rules of business are changing. So it's much more open now. The possibilities are many more. Technology enables that. So having a collaborative mindset. Now, one would argue that it was there even earlier, and everything about culture remains true for several decades or years. But it is far more pronounced. This idea of collaboration is far more pronounced now than ever. I think the second aspect of culture, far more pronounced than before, is about the idea of experimentation. And how do we actually bring about the experimentation genes alive much more than it has ever been, right? Because the technology is changing so fast that if we do not experiment fast, then automatically we are slower than what the technology changes. And no matter what what company it is and how much is the speed of transformation, one is always going to find that lots of things are happening outside. And therefore, to embrace experimentation is a very different order. I think it's a big cultural shift for many, many different parts of the entire ecosystem, whether it is big brands, whether it is big companies, whether it is small companies, medium companies. So if I were to think of culture and put on one side this idea of collaboration and enhancing that in a very dramatic manner, and the other idea of experimentation, I think these two are the most important aspects.
We also know that we are possibly the only generation, Rahul, which will see this shift from a very different kind of media to the new age media. Digital media, which is what we call the online media, and I'm not including television in that, I still call that a traditional media, but has not really created a brand individually, has not managed to create an impact by creating, I can't turn around and say this is a particular brand which has been created purely on online basis. Now that could be a time factor, that it has not been there for that long a period. Or is there some other flaw in this? Or we're not treating it right?
See, the reality is that consumers do not experience and segregate between what we call, from an industry perspective, traditional, offline and online, right? So consumers have multiple influences which are taking place, whether it is media or the way they live their lives. And therefore, I think the first principle has to be put into place, which is about being consumer-centric and consumer-first. Very often people ask me, should we be thinking digital first or should we be thinking mobile first? And my response is always very simple, which is think consumer first. Know who your customer or consumer is, and depending on what they consume, how they live their lives, then adapt, whether it is media or otherwise. I think there's no doubt that the lines between what we call traditional and online and digital, etc., are blurring, right? They're continuously blurring. In fact, they're one and the same almost now. Having said that, it's important to distinguish what the job or the function of each of these, the roles that each of these different touch points play. In some cases, it is pure entertainment. In some cases, it is information. In some cases, it is a combination of both these three things.
Sure.
One of the biggest changes that digital media or technology has brought about is the ability to take action immediately after the impact or influence, right? So as an example, if you watched a television ad or you saw a billboard, it required you to get into a store and then actually buy it or, then explore further. Whereas in today's world, you can seamlessly transit in the digital world from exploring something, getting to know of something, and a point of information, interest, consideration, and quickly move into the purchase. So, this, what you could think of the shrinkage of the funnel, and actually the classic funnel, being upturned is a very important dimension, and very often people do not think of it that way. You made a great point, Sameer. You talked about, are there, can brands be built only on online media, or can be brand built digitally? Think of some of the biggest brands in the world, which are digital companies only, right? Almost. And they've been built primarily on digital. Does not mean that they are not there on television or billboards or whatever, because they're thinking customer first. So they probably have a little bit of presence outside, but a large part of their presence is actually in the online medium itself. So I think the key principle always has to be consumer first, and then sort of thinking of what the touch points are.
Let me ask you a question from an agency perspective, and we've been talking about integrated agencies as the new word. I mean, a traditional advertising agency says, we are an integrated company. A digital marketing company is now transforming itself into an integrated company. And a lot of people are talking about ideas which are media agnostic. It really does not matter where it goes, as long as it's the same idea being repetitive. I mean, we are being repetitive about the same communication. So on the other side, a client possibly, or a CMO or a marketing team sitting across the table says, I do not want integrated. I want specialized cells. What works better from a brand perspective? An integrated approach, an integrated agency, or multiple specialized agencies?
See, the idea of integrated versus specialism, and these are, if you think of these as two ends of the spectrum, then the ideal sweet spot is where you can have an integration and specialism, right? If you can have both, why not? And that's sort of the ideal world. I think the jury is still out on which of these are better. I don't think personally that it is one solution which says, oh, integrated is amazing, and let's forget specialism, or for that matter, specialist partners are better and let's not be integrated. I think it depends a lot on the context. And that's not a cop-out, like I'm not saying everything depends on the context, quite obviously. So in this case, I think what one has to really think of is what serves both the partners very well. There are some brilliant people who are very specialist, and sometimes they have to have a seat at the table, and that's perfectly fine. In general, my point of view is that it is better to do a few things really well rather than to do many things which are average. So as a partner preference, it is always about, do you do things brilliantly? Are you being super effective? And therefore, I like to think of the sweet spot as a good level of integration, regardless of how many partners are there, but best in class in their own right when it comes to that. Average is quite clearly not a winning formula anymore. So I think a degree of excellence is absolutely something which everybody should cultivate.
Digital transformation, which we touched upon earlier, is now going to bring massive opportunities for many businesses to scale themselves up to a global level if they need to, or if they're ready to do that. How different is it when you work at a country level versus working at a global level?
Quite naturally, the country level operations, or for that matter, local operations vis-a-vis global, there are multiple dimensions which are different. The way I always think about it as finally, you have to win at the last mile, which typically is local. It is in your village, it is in your town, in your city, whatever it might be. And therefore, it is important that one is centered around winning, which is usually about winning locally. We like to talk about like the global model, right? How do we use the best of global and how do we use the best of local? Local when it comes to insight, the demand signals, the consumer preferences, but at the same time using global wireframes and making sure that, the global, whether it is a technology wireframe, whether it's a process wireframe, the brand, the proposition can actually travel. Again, the reality is that winning locally will remain important because consumption is always in the last mile. And to the best extent possible, if one has these global wireframes which are deployed, then they're great sources of efficiency, they're great sources of speed, and indeed of quality. I mean, you think about about every technology platform. When I say every, meaning almost all, the ones which we know, are truly global. Think of Facebook, think of Amazon, think of Instagram, think of any other global platform, and you will see that the technology wireframe is similar, which cuts across brilliantly, but at the same time fulfills the local needs as well very well, and a degree of adaptation. But I think this is a new phenomena where technology loves scale, it travels very fast, and therefore makes it much easier to deploy. So I feel that for all companies which have aspirations which are global, the idea is to not think just global, but think local, which is how do you become a global company by winning locally across different countries or regions.
Having said that, there is a larger concern with the economy overall today, right? Thanks to the situation we are in. Globalization versus localization is a dilemma which sort of covers, or a fair bit of entrepreneurs are concerned about that today. A fair bit of marketers are concerned about that today. Where do you see that going from here?
There is no doubt that it's a raging discussion right now across a number of countries on this idea of globalization and localization. No question that self-sufficiency, self-reliance are themes which have had a greater degree of conversational impact in recent times. But quite clearly, to my mind, the world has moved global. And it is almost irreversible in many ways. And while the idea of self-sufficiency and self-reliance is very romantic and enticing, it's impractical. It's simply speaking, you cannot grow vegetables in your own backyard and be self-sufficient anymore. You have to, and much the same way, you expand it to your community, you expand it to your city. So I think certainly for the most part, in most countries, supply chains are global. Even if it's made locally, it's quite likely that the raw materials come from somewhere else. And therefore, globalization is very much here to stay. I think the idea of local, and definitely the pandemic has brought to life this idea that one needs to actually make sure that a lot of strength or resilience is there within an economy or a country or a community. And that is absolutely true. But we cannot substitute that for saying, look, it's going to be very micro and, everything is going to go back to how it was during the good old hundreds of years back or 2000 years back. The other aspect to think about, and I often read about a narrative which talks of global companies or multinationals and local companies. But the reality is that, again, from a financial market perspective, guess what? There's large amount of globalization. Some of the best local banks, the best local companies have large shareholdings, which are financial institutions, quite often foreign. Even if they're local, they are actually local but multinational domestic institutions. So this idea, so when you think of capital flows, when you think of many other aspects of supply chain flows, material flows, definitely I think it is all about a lot about globalization. But by no means does that mean that businesses, countries, economies should not think of resilience, think of reliance, think of self-sustainable sort of creating ecosystems. But I personally feel that globalization is very much here because while the world may not be entirely flat, for sure we know that it is a lot flatter and it's irreversible.
In the last few years, we have seen the rise of young leaders like you. How do you think the leaders of this generation are different from the leaders we have seen in the past?
Firstly, Sameer, thanks for thinking of me as a young leader, right? Quite clearly, that is not the case anymore, although I'd like to believe that I'm still very young. But having said that, I think the question you're asking is really what are some of the changes that are very visible, especially among those who are coming up as young leaders. And I interview a lot of people every year, engage with a large number of youngsters, I mentor quite a few. And if I were to distill, there are three changes that I distinctly see. I think the first is they have just an incredible level of drive, much more than what I've ever seen, right? So they're just super driven, working very hard, and much more knowledge about everything that's going on, really well read, and almost in a manner, if you were to not know that they're young people, you could almost think that they're like 40, 50-year-old CMOs. So really bright when it comes to, I'm not just saying marketing, but across all the fields.
Sure.
The second is that they have an incredible level of what you can call information, a point of view, and almost passion for making the world a better place, right? I'm calling it very loosely, but they're driven by this idea of sustainability, making the world a better place, have a point of view about it, and are fearless to express it. So I think that's the second big difference. So this idea of very high drive, a very big focus on sustainability, and you could call them purpose driven or whatever in jargon terms, but basically, wanting to make the world a better place, a second big dimension. And the third is just a greater degree of what I would call as openness to multiple options and to be able to do multiple things, right? So I grew up in a world where when we thought of options and what we have to do and how we can do what we want to do to build our careers, we talked of 3-4 different things. And typically speaking, now if you speak with a youngster, regardless of what their age is, but all of them actually have on their slate a large number of options, many which we would not even have considered. So that's a huge difference. And therefore, in the point about that multiple options is that they're much more expansive in their thinking than we ever were. And which is one of the reasons why you see that a large number of startups, big successful companies of different types are being built by the youngsters. How many youngsters go and build the next motorcycle or the next car? What they do is stuff which, most people have not thought of before. When we say, the startup world is populated by ideas, and because they're expansive in their thinking, the youngsters are making a huge difference to entrepreneurial businesses in general.
So sure they are. There's no doubt about that. But let's go back to what you said at the beginning, which is sustainability is a big thing for this generation. Does this thought come from somewhere that this generation has had way more resources than we've had in our times, or our previous generation had, and therefore the need was to first establish yourself and get the basics in place, and therefore we could not even think beyond our own needs or family's needs or maybe a city's needs. This generation is thinking way beyond that because we've had that resource. The previous generations have given them a platform and allowed them to think like that.
I think the current generation, and when I say current, I mean the current young generation, thinks more about making the world a better place, because they have much more information, right? Yes. I mean, for hundreds of years, for several hundreds of years, actually the young have always created movements and created revolutions, right? The student community has always been a force for good for many, many centuries, leave alone years. What's happening now is that they're much better informed. So that's, I think, the point number one. Point number two is that they are not hesitant to express. So because they're not hesitant to express, they are actually, and this applies to a large extent because of social media, but even in general, even outside of social media, the expressiveness is much more, and therefore, they can actually put their thoughts across in a much forceful manner than they ever been. And the third big dimension of this change of what the young generation is thinking about is they don't want to watch it happen, because I think often people talk about being let down by the earlier generation, which is typically ours or a little older. Either it was consumerism or too much that we had focused on just growth without looking at the impact of whether it's societies or the planet. And that's changing. They are way more thinking about it and saying, hey, we can't, this is not sustainable. So they get it. And because they get it, they're also able to take actions around it.
How do brands and companies, how should they apply transparency, in order to achieve or break through into the next generation's mind?
See, the new consumers, the younger generation think of transparency much more than it has ever been. And to them, transparency is really 3-4 things to my mind. Number one is, what do you stand for as a business or a brand? People ask that question much more vocally than it's ever been asked. What are you all about? Like, where do you come? It could be to do with origin. It could be to do with, what your point of view is on a particular issue, etc. The second is that they don't only ask that question, but they actually in many ways vote with their wallet. Therefore, you will see that the consumption patterns, the buying patterns of the young are actually guided by this. So it's not only an academic question of what it belongs, but they would forcefully tell you that they buy a product or don't buy a particular product or a brand or a service. And I think that has big implications, which is what businesses have to acknowledge and appreciate. I think the point on transparency in their life is not only related to brands and businesses, but about life in general. A large part of that is fueled by information. They have access to tremendous amount of information. They can debate, talk, digest a large number of sources, much more than what you could. I mean, they're classically the multitasking generation, and therefore they absorb, everything that's being thrown at them far more vigorously and form their own points of view. So the idea of transparency, in the digital world, in the new world, there is nowhere to hide for anyone, whether it is in politics, whether it is in business, whether it is in just the way we live our lives as families. And therefore, I think transparency is a very, very important virtue that everybody needs to cultivate.
How does AI change us or our thought process from a transparency and sustainability point of view?
See, when we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are really relating it to a level of automation. Nothing but a set of rule engines, a set of processes which can be automated and therefore either serve the consumers better, or indeed in some cases even actually manage the costs much better. So the way I think, because now information is so fluid, really visible, transparent, spread across the entire board, the ability to process that information is very important. And that ability to process information, whether it is in the form of data science or analytics, or indeed applying some rules, and therefore the combination of all those things are the ones which can actually enhance the way we operate. There comes the point about, how does this actually benefit, whether you call it transparency or whether you call it sustainability. I think when it comes to transparency, it is a lot of that is really down to actually how information is made available and how it is processed. Now, given that there are vast troves, there are any number of intelligent processes which can actually distill down from these vast troves of information to what you really need, right? I mean, the simplest the best example of that is the Google search engine, which actually, trawls through the entire net and gets to you pretty much a result that you want. And that's a process of really taking everything that's out there and then making sense of it to the way the consumer or customer wants it. And of course, in this case, I'm giving the most simplistic example of how it is at work, but conceptually, that is what pretty much applies to everything else.
I've had a great time chatting with Rahul. I'm sure you guys had fun too, listening to his insights. I think they were phenomenal. But this is not where it ends. We are going to see Rahul Welde again in the next episode. But this time with a twist. The next episode will feature the next generation. We're going to compare his answers to what the next generation thinks. See you soon.